know that this congregation is a very, very smart congregation. And because of that, I decided we would start this morning's sermon with a little quiz. So if you take your bulletins, if you have the little one, actually either the little one or the big one, on the third page you're going to see the numbers 1 through 7, and next to that it says TYA, not CYA, TYA. And let me explain to you what we're going to do. And while I'm explaining, you can fish around, find a pencil or a pen, something you can write with. These won't be collected. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a list of quotations, proclamations, headlines, if you will. And the task, okay, I'm going to say this loudly, is not whether you agree or disagree with these statements. Your task is to try to figure out roughly when it came from. So the T stands for today, something that's probably been a headline in the last, let's say, year to year and a half. That's today. The Y means yesterday, and I'm going to be talking more in a couple of minutes about this book called The Mindset Lists of American History, which covers a period from 1890 forward to 2026, but on your quiz, yesterday it means roughly between 1890 and 1950. And then ancient times is back in biblical times, back around 2000 when Paul was writing, or maybe 2700 when Micah was propheting. So it's not agree or disagree, it's just when you think this probably was the headline of the day. And if for one or two of them you think, well, maybe it happened, if more was a headline in more than one time period, it's okay to mark 2 answers. Number 1, and we're going to do this fairly quickly. The key leaders of our nation are unquestionably corrupt. Today, yesterday, and ancient times. The key leaders of our nation are unquestionably corrupt. 2, too many people in the government are living lives of luxury off the hard work of our nation's people. Too many people in the government are living lives of luxury off the hard work of our nation's people. 3, in recent decades, honesty and decency have vanished, and families are filled with strife. In recent decades, honesty and decency have vanished, and families are filled with strife. 4, today's dishonest business practices, which affect all of us, must be stopped. Today's dishonest business practices, which affect all of us, must be stopped. 5 is some, and perhaps many, of today's religious leaders are corrupt, seeking only personal gain. Some, perhaps many, of today's religious leaders are corrupt, seeking only personal gain. 6, most government leaders today agree that it's essential for our nation to invest heavily in military defense, in both weapons and personnel. Most government leaders today agree it's essential for our nation to invest heavily in military defense, in both weapons and personnel. And number 7, the refugees pouring over our borders may be fleeing their homelands for a good reason, but the public resources we have simply cannot support them. The refugees pouring over our borders may be fleeing their homelands for a good reason, but the public resources we have simply cannot support them. So now we're going to score them. I want you to add up how many T's you have and put that number at the bottom, how many Y's you have, put that at the bottom, and then how many A's you've marked and put that at the bottom. So you don't absolutely have to raise your hands, but if you're brave, I invite you to. How many of you marked at least 4 of those coming from the today time frame? Bunch, folks. How many of you marked at least 4 coming from that 1890s to 1950s time frame? How many of you marked at least 3 coming from that biblical time frame? Okay, first piece of good news today, you all score 100%. Whatever you put down, there are no wrong answers, because each of those statements I read you was a concern that was just as real, just as rampant, just as public in the time of Micah and in the time of Paul as it was in the time of our parents or our grandparents or our grandparents, and just as real as they are today in the time that we live in. Now, knowing that you are a smart congregation, I'm betting that nearly everybody in here this morning, except Bob and I, we never read our paper till nighttime, but we use our iPads. I'm betting almost everybody in here this morning either open your newspaper, turn on the TV, or turn on your computer so that you could catch up on the breaking news headlines. And I'm willing to bet that part of what is so disappointing for so many of us is that what we hear day after day is not news at all. And I'm not talking about fake news, I'm talking about it's old stuff. It's old patterns and conflicts and injustices that appear to have been going on about as long as there were people to at least write it down so we knew it was going on. Olds about divisions between people, or between groups of people, or between political factions, oppression of groups of others, and the others change over time historically. And I think what makes it so hard is that not only are we living in the middle of this right now, but it almost feels to some of us like we've moved beyond the point of being able to simply disagree to where it feels like we violently disagree, that our disagreements somehow justify living in more and more violent ways. A news reporter I heard not long ago describes the American people, where the American people are, as addicted to aggression. And the picture he painted is not simply people who are different from each other, but who are kind of at each other's throats, and it manifests in the forms of school shootings and road rage incidents and the murders of innocent citizens in their own backyards. And I would guess that a whole lot of us in here at some point simply turn off our iPads or close our newspapers or turn off the television and say, I just simply cannot listen to this anymore. I just cannot bear, it breaks my heart to hear about another school shooting. And I can also guess that most of us in here are not enjoying living this way. I'm guessing a lot of us would really like to return to the good old days, the gentler and kinder days, even though historians suggest they haven't always been that much gooder or gentler or kinder for everybody. But we don't want to live in a world that's filled with anger. We don't want to live in a world where we feel surrounded by hatred. We want to feel safe. We want the people around us to be safe. We want to feel loved. The second piece of good news then this morning is that while I know there are many very, very bad things going on in this country right now, and that I believe with everything in me that we are called to do whatever we can to end them, even if it's like the little hummingbird doing what we can do, to remember that not all the news is bad. And it's so easy to get sucked into a mindset where all we can focus on is what's wrong and not what's right. And there is so much that indeed is right. Now, this book that I showed you earlier is from our local library. It's called Mindset Lists American History. And I'm down to the last chapter, been reading it the last couple of weeks. And it's a study out of Beloit College in Wisconsin. What they're doing, they go all the way back to 1890, and they look at various kinds of trends in each 20-year period. And what to do is so interesting about this book is that each chapter is written from the perspective of, this is how things have always been. It will give you a totally new perspective on reading history. So, for example, the 1920s period, rum has always been demonic. In the mid-1940s, the shadow has always known. Mid-1990s, Michelangelo has always been a turtle. And for the projected class 2026, they have never needed a key for anything. It's fascinating because each of these takes on, this is how it's always been, contrasts so markedly with the fact that the way things have always been is they have always been changing. They have always been different. They have never stayed the same. And the second reason I commend the book to you is that it has two very different, broadly different kinds of information that are intermingled. It's not like, here's the good news and here's the bad news. It's intermingled as life is. And so there's this whole set of what we might call the good news. Developments of their time were often described as miracles or wonders of the modern age, like the zipper. We assume that men have always been able to zip their pants. The apartment. Sterile rows of rooms for those who, for whatever reason, are unable to have a true home of their own. Flickers. How many of you know what flickers were? Few people know flickers, which became the talking pictures, which became films and cinema. And Jell-O. There has not always been room for Jell-O, only since about 1940. And things like typewriters and credit cards and pantsuits for women and t-shirts for both men and women and disposable diapers and computers. And all of those things, each time they've been introduced, have transformed the lives of most people for the better. And intermeshed with that, interrelated with all that, is some of the bad news. The patterns of pain and injustice and oppression. And what struck me so in reading this, as in each of these 20-year segments, the feelings are expressed just as strongly about this set of people as it were the previous time period about that set of people. And so, for example, if you lived just before the turn of the century, Northerners in this country hated Southerners and vice versa. So if your brother in Cleveland was thinking about marrying that sweet little gal from down in Savannah, the family would have to think about that. The pioneers who made their ways out west, the direct flow, they had two enemies always: Indians and Easterners, who just didn't get them in their way of life. In the 30s, violence against women and their supporters when they sought the right to vote was rampant, because people in power were convinced if women could vote too, it would split the ticket. They would automatically vote differently from their husbands, and that would just destroy our political system. That just couldn't happen. The 40s, people of Japanese descent and German descent were targets of national hatred. In the late 40s, the word homosexual was added to the English translation of the Bible. And it allowed, if not encouraged, churches right along society, which had already been making life incredibly hard for LGBTQ people, made it possible for churches to start preaching even more strongly against those folks and trying to keep them out of polite society. And then for we younger folks who don't remember any of that, we can take it from there. We know the 50s, most of us, not all of you, and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I'm guessing if we did a handful, it'd be pretty easy to get you a list who at any given time have always been in, have always been welcome, have always been the good people, and those people who have always been other. Now, while Mindsets book only touches on faith communities occasionally, they were talking, for example, up through about the 1970s or 80s, in any community of size, you had a Methodist church, you had a Lutheran church, you had a Presbyterian church. Interestingly, you had a Congregational church, and then you had some other people who say they went to church but weren't real Christians. You don't remember the prejudice against Catholics and Jewish people. You're very young. But throughout all of these changes and all of these struggles, there have always been men and women and children and maybe hummingbirds, who knows, who have tried so hard to live out of their faith, to live out what Micah calls us to live out what Jesus calls us to live out what in his better moments Paul calls us to, and to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. That's a hard one. I'll do that one at the very end. But trying to expand our definition of who our neighbor is, trying to live in real daily ways, the way of justice and compassion and peace that Christ models for us. And I think they've done that because hopefully, and I hope we remember it too, there's a third piece of good news for today. And that's that we have choices. Especially those of us in here this morning. We almost always have choices about what we'll say, who will speak for and against, what we'll do, how we'll act, how we'll vote, what we'll buy, what we won't buy. And it shouldn't really be that hard to make the choices for justice and for kindness, for greater compassion. It shouldn't be that hard because biologists have always known, at least for the last 100 years, they've always known that human beings are hardwired to care for each other. One of the earliest studies I remember reading a billion years ago as a psychology major was a study in an infant, a neonatal nursery. And if you've ever been in a neonatal nursery, you know the babies are all lying there, they're all sound asleep, and one baby starts crying. What happens? Whole group goes, you betcha. And interestingly, the more recent research showed there are actually brain changes that the kids are. These are newborns empathizing with what they perceive as the pain of those other babies. And anthropologists are doing the most astonishing research, especially the last couple of decades, I told Ken I was going to walk over like this and say, well, you know, if you know about anthropologists who study primates, you know, they study grooming, which is a very social behavior. But there's new research. There's a guy named Frans de Waal. He is a Dutch ethologist, and the library has some of his wonderful book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. But he studies chimpanzees and bonobos, which are related to chimpanzees, both in the wild and in captivity. And what he has found goes far beyond any of that other research on grooming. One of the things he's found is that if a mother bonobo gives birth and she's injured or she's ill following the birth, other bonobos in the troop, and it's not just the females, sometimes it's the males, will take that baby and they will raise it until the mama is well enough. He's shown that when a bonobo in the group is distressed for some reason, other bonobos go over and they coo to it and they pat it on the shoulder. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, it's kind of like Sheldon going, there. Bonobos do that. That is so cool. And when another bonobo is hungry, members of the troop will give them their food, even if it means they are going to go hungry. De Waal says that moral behavior doesn't begin and end with religion. It is wired into our very evolution. And there was another quote along these lines, a really good thing on Netflix called Beyond Our Differences, where they were reflecting on some of this research, looking at how people treat each other and when and why and how we're kind to each other. This one historian says, it appears from all the research that love is built into our very atoms. It appears that love is built into our very atoms. We are wired to care for each other. We are wired to love kindness and to do justice. And on top of all that wiring, if we've grown up in Sunday school or in the church, one of the things we've learned all the way along is that the core of the Christian faith is love. One of the first scripture verses, any of us, if you're old enough to have lived back when they made you memorize scripture verses, first verses any of us memorized was John 3:16. For God so loved the world. And the first song we ever sang as kids was Jesus Loves Me. And our moms and our dads, if we were lucky, they taught us we were loved. And that we were to be kind to each other. And if anybody wants to say, hey, where's the Christian faith in a nutshell? You go to that place where Jesus is always getting to ask, what are the loopholes? Who do I not have to love? And Jesus comes back to me and says, okay, out of all of the commandments, all the stuff we're supposed to do, not just the Big Ten that Charlton Heston brought down from Mount Sinai, but the 613 mitzvot commandments that are in the Old Testament, which is most important? What does Jesus say? It's to love. It's to love God with everything in us and to love one another as we love ourselves. And yet that seems really hard to do sometimes. And it seems even harder to do when we are in a time of change. Because it turns out that not only are we hardwired to love, we are also hardwired to be fearful when change happens. To get anxious. We revert to all of those many years ago when our ancestors were living in forests and in caves, and if something little changed, a twig snapped, or there was an odd smell, or there was a shadow that hadn't been there before, it told you you had better run like hell because you're about to get eaten up by something. And no matter how smart we are, or educated, or sophisticated, even today, when something changes, we can get scared. We certainly can get anxious, which is one of the reasons I chose to preach on this text this morning, because this church is an in-between period. We're in between pastors, and that is always the time of anxiety for people. People are grieving. Our last pastor, Pastor Jeffrey, is now serving a church in Wisconsin, and so our hearts are hurting. We miss him and wishing him well, and at the same time, everybody's going, well, what will we get next? Will anybody want us? What will they be like if they do? Will we move them? So I chose these passages today from Micah and from Paul to remind us that despite our anxiety or fearfulness or whatever it is we're struggling with right now, we are still called as God's faithful people to keep on keeping on. To keep on doing our very best to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with our God. And not just in the abstract, oh, I just love people. That's not love, friends. That's a feeling. Love's getting in there and doing something about it. And the fourth and final piece of good news I want to share with you this morning is right here, this church is doing a bang-up job of keeping on, doing justice and loving kindness. We have a member in this church who shows up every week, doesn't charge the church a dime, and mows all of our lawns. We have a member of this church who shows up every week and takes care of our backyard courtyard. We have people who come and cut the roses. We have people, has anybody come and trim the bushes? That's a question. Yes, and we have had people come and trim the bushes because we couldn't see our sign. We have people who make sure the water system is working and that our sinks aren't running over. We have two people who left us last Friday to go down to Tucson. They and some friends from Crossroads United Methodist are going down partnering with the UCC church in Tucson, a little tiny church down there. And we had a call kind of in the middle of the week in church chat saying they're going down. If you can, they want to take baby food and baby supplies. When they left Friday morning, they had 5 enormous boxes filled with baby food and diapers and baby wipes and donations of another $250 to help care for migrant children. We have people in this congregation who volunteer all over this community. We have lions and tigers and bears, oh my. We have people who volunteer with Strive and with the library and with Spellbinders and with Grey Gourmet and with Hope West. Folks, every one of those things is part of doing justice and loving kindness. And I encourage all of you to think about right now at this time in the life of our church, what might it be that you could do besides sticking your feet in the air, which will help hold up the sky, but what else might you be called to do to make that happen in our church and community? Because we do walk with God, and that's the hard part, is remembering that. The hard part is trusting that just maybe God has a bigger picture view than we do. That just maybe God has a new vision for this church of some kind that we haven't even begun to imagine. And our job, besides keeping on, is to keep on and try walking in trust. Trusting in God, trusting in each other. And trusting that while some things are indeed pretty darn dark in our world right now, we are called to be the light that our world needs. It's a lot of good news. My hope is when you leave, you'll remember at least one piece of it. Amen.